The hearing was on a Thursday in March. Wilson County Family Court. Second floor. The kind of room where the fluorescent light has been slightly wrong for probably 20 years and nobody has done anything about it. I sat at a long table with my attorney, Margaret Holloway. Krista sat at a table across the room. She was wearing a gray blazer I'd never seen before. Her attorney must have suggested it. Danny wasn't in the courtroom. He was with the guardian ad litem in a waiting room down the hall. Margaret had told me he'd probably be asked to speak to the judge separately, in chambers. I kept thinking about that. About Danny in a room with a judge, trying to explain things that shouldn't be his job to explain. Krista's lawyer, a man named Fletcher who was maybe 30 years old, and had the energy of someone who had recently discovered how to be confident, spent 11 minutes telling the judge that I was the problem. He used phrases like history of interference and boundary violations. He said I had weaponized my background as a nurse to make a grieving family feel under surveillance. He said, "Your Honor, my client has rebuilt her life after tremendous loss. She has a supportive partner and a stable home, Mrs. Calloway has filed 7 separate reports with the Department of Children's Services in 8 months. 7. At some point, Your Honor, excessive concern becomes harassment." I wrote the number 7 on my notepad, underlined it once. Then Krista took the stand. She was calm. She had been coached well. She said Ruth had never accepted her, that Brian had complained about his mother's need to control things, that she had tried for years to include me, and I had never been satisfied. Then she said, "Danny doesn't even really call her grandma anymore. He's close to Wade. Wade is patient with him. He goes to his games. He's building a relationship. That's a real grandfather figure." She paused. "Ruth is... she's from the old part of Danny's life. He's a little boy. He's moving forward." I did not look up from the notepad. I had spent 28 years in the pediatric ward at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I had documented behavioral indicators of abuse and neglect for 2.5 decades. I knew the difference between a child who was thriving and a child who was shrinking. I had written that difference down, carefully, in dated entries, since the first Tuesday in July of last year. I drew a line under the 7. Then I wrote a number beneath it. I slid the notepad across to Margaret. She looked at the number. She looked at me. Then she stood up and asked the judge for permission to submit documentation into evidence. The judge said yes. Fletcher looked at his own table. His jaw tightened the way it does when someone realizes the room has changed. The number on my notepad was 47. "My name is Ruth Calloway. I am 64 years old. I live in Lebanon, Tennessee, which is in Wilson County, about 30 miles east of Nashville. I have lived in the same brick ranch house for 37 years. The front porch has a swing that Earl built in 1992. I haven't sat in it since he died. I started in the pediatric ward at Vanderbilt when I was 33 years old. I'd done my first 8 years in adult med-surg, and I thought I knew what the work would feel like in any unit. Pediatrics corrected that assumption quickly. In pediatrics, you learn to read what isn't being said. Children don't have the vocabulary yet, or the permission, to name what's happening to them. So you read posture. You read sleep patterns. You read the way a child stops making eye contact with an adult they used to look at freely. You read the things that used to bring a child comfort and now bring them to stillness instead. You learn to document all of it not because you know what it means yet, but because the documentation is what allows someone else to see a pattern when you can't see the whole picture yet. I did that for 28 years. I retired at 61 because my knees started making decisions for me. I had a full pension from Vanderbilt, a house that was paid for, and no idea what I was going to do with my Tuesday mornings. My son Brian had been dead for 2 years by then. He died in a construction site accident in August. He was 34. He left behind a wife named Krista, a daughter-in-law I had always tried to understand, and a 7-year-old boy named Danny who had his father's laugh, and after that August, no idea what to do with it. There was a drawing on my refrigerator. Danny made it when he was 5, the year before Brian died. 4 figures in crayon green for the grass, blue sky, yellow sun in the corner, the way 5-year-olds always put it. The figures are labeled Mama, Daddy, Danny, Grandma Ruth. Brian's figure is the tallest. He has what Danny apparently felt was a very significant hat. I look at that drawing every morning when I make coffee. I want to tell you that so you understand what I was trying to protect and what it cost me to do it correctly instead of just doing it fast. After Brian died, I tried to stay present in Danny's life without overstepping. That balance is harder to walk than it sounds. Krista was grieving. She was 29 years old and suddenly a single mother, and she didn't always have the patience to include me. I understood that. I kept the visits on her schedule. I didn't push. For the first 1.5 years, it worked. I had Danny on alternating Saturday afternoons, and sometimes on Sunday mornings when Krista needed a break. We went to the Lebanon farmers market. We watched movies on my couch with the dog. Danny would draw at my kitchen table while I made dinner, and he'd hold up his drawings and I'd say that's a very significant hat, and he'd laugh like I'd said something brilliant. Krista started seeing Wade about 18 months after Brian died. I found out because Danny mentioned him. He said Mama's friend Wade once, casually, in the car on the way to the farmer's market, the way children mention things they think you already know. "Who's Wade?" I asked. "He drives trucks," Danny said. "He's loud." I filed that away and said nothing. The first time I met Wade was a Sunday afternoon in April. I came to pick Danny up for lunch and Wade answered the door. He was a large man, not unfriendly, but with a quality of taking up space that filled the doorway without seeming to notice it. He looked at me the way someone looks at a delivery they weren't expecting. He said Krista was getting ready and stepped back so I could come in. Danny was in the living room watching television. He looked up when I came in and something crossed his face that I identified before I could name it: relief. I named it later that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad Earl had always kept there for grocery lists. I wrote the date. I wrote, Danny, facial expression on my arrival, relief. Check in 2 weeks. I know what relief looks like on a child. In pediatrics, you saw it when the parent left the room. I want to be clear. I was not certain of anything at that point. I was watching. That's all. After 28 years of watching children, I had learned not to act on a single observation. You wait for the pattern. The pattern came over 4 months. The first thing I noticed was his drawings. Danny had always drawn people with faces. Detailed faces, eyes, mouths, sometimes little expressions. He had a whole cast of characters he'd been developing for 2 years, including a superhero with again a significant hat. By June, the people in his drawings had no faces, or faces turned away, or no people at all, just buildings, vehicles, roads going nowhere in particular. The second thing was the quiet. Danny had always been a talker in the car. On the drive back to Krista's after our visits, he'd ask questions the entire way about trucks, clouds, why certain roads were named what they were, what I thought would happen if you mixed 2 different colors of Jell-O. That summer, he started looking out the window. The third thing was what happened in August. I was dropping Danny off after a Saturday lunch. We pulled into the driveway. Wade's truck was there. Danny saw the truck and went still. Not scared, or rather, not dramatically scared, just careful. He unbuckled his seatbelt more slowly than usual. He made sure his drawing pad was zipped into his backpack. I asked him if everything was okay. He said yes and got out of the car. I watched him walk to the front door. He knocked, which was strange because it was his home. He had a key. He knocked. That night I wrote 4 pages in the legal pad. Dates, times, behavioral observations, clinical language, not emotional language. I had learned years ago that feelings don't hold up in documentation. Facts do. I called Krista the next morning. I asked if Danny seemed tired lately, if anything was bothering him at home. She said he was fine, that school was starting soon and he was nervous about 3rd grade, and that she knew what was best for her son. I said, I understand. I called the Wilson County Department of Children's Services the following day. The first report I filed did not result in action. A caseworker came to Krista's house, met with Krista and Danny, and wrote in the assessment that the child appeared comfortable, well-fed, and appropriately groomed, with no visible signs of physical abuse. The report noted the grandmother's concerns and described them as stemming from adjustment difficulties following the death of her son and the introduction of a new partner into the family unit. I read that assessment 3 times. Then I called Margaret Holloway. Margaret is a family law attorney in Nashville. She is 57, methodical, and has a 2011 Subaru with a Wilson County Humane Society bumper sticker that she has never explained to me, and I have never asked about. She had handled a custody case for a colleague of mine from Vanderbilt 3 years earlier. I called that colleague, got Margaret's number, and drove to Nashville the following Thursday. Margaret listened to everything I had without interrupting me. Then she said, keep documenting everything. Date, time, specific behavioral observation, clinical language, no interpretation. Every incident, every visit, every call you made and whether they answered. I said, I've been doing that. She said, show me. I handed her the yellow legal pad. She read it. She set it down. Mrs. Calloway, she said, this is good. Keep going. I kept going. In September, Krista reduced my visitation from twice per month to once per month. She sent a text that said Danny was having a hard time with transitions right now and that the visits were confusing for him emotionally. She said she'd let me know when things settled down. I wrote it down. Date, time, exact language. In October, I filed a second report with DCS. This one included a typed summary of my behavioral observations, organized chronologically, with clinical terminology from the pediatric nursing literature I had spent my career working in. I attached dates. The second caseworker, a different one, called me before the home visit. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, can I ask what your professional background is?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "All right, let me schedule that visit." This second visit went differently. The caseworker spent 90 minutes at the house instead of the standard 45. She asked to speak with Danny alone for part of the visit. I don't know what Danny said. I do know that after the visit, the caseworker opened a more formal assessment. Krista called me that evening. She said, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this needs to stop." I said, "I understand you're upset. You're putting ideas in Danny's head," she said. "He's confused because of you." The caseworker asked him if he was afraid at home. "He's 8 years old. You're teaching him to be afraid of his own house." I said, "I haven't talked to Danny about any of this." "Then why is my son telling a stranger he gets nervous when Wade raises his voice?" I didn't answer. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, the 4 figures, the significant hat. In November, Krista stopped the visits entirely. She said she needed time. She said her attorney had advised her that the visits were emotionally disruptive for Danny. I hired Margaret on a full retainer the following Monday. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in December. It was the week before Christmas. Donna, she was my closest friend from the pediatric ward. We've had Tuesday breakfast together at the Waffle House on 231 for 11 years. Donna had made me come out even though I didn't want to. I hadn't been sleeping. I was deep enough in the documentation and the legal back and forth that I had started losing track of what normal felt like. Donna ordered her usual scattered, smothered, covered, and she doesn't deviate from that, and she let me talk for about 10 minutes. Then she said, "You're describing him the way you used to describe the kids on the ward." "I know," I said. "That's not a bad thing," she said. "That's the thing that's going to get him home." The server refilled my coffee without being asked. Outside it was raining. The slow December rain that comes into Tennessee sideways. Donna ate her hash browns and didn't say anything else about it. That was the right thing to do. I needed the silence more than I needed the words. I drove home thinking about Brian. About the fact that he died not knowing any of this would happen. That the life he built for Danny wasn't the life Danny ended up in. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before I went inside. Then I went in and made more coffee and opened the legal pad to the next blank page. In January, Danny told his school counselor, a woman named Sharon Pruitt at Lebanon Elementary, that he didn't like going home after school on the days Wade was there. Sharon asked him why. He said Wade got angry when the TV was too loud. He said Wade had knocked something off a shelf once when he was angry, and it had broken. He said Wade called him stupid sometimes. "He says it like it's a joke," Danny told Sharon, "but it doesn't feel like a joke." Sharon documented all of it. She filed a mandatory report. She called me because I was listed as an emergency contact and because, as she told me later, she had been watching Danny since October and had been waiting to understand what she was seeing. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, I've been a school counselor for 16 years. I know when a child has been coached to say something. Danny wasn't coached. He told me this slowly, like he was deciding how much was safe to say." I said, "How is he?" "He's okay," she said. "He asked if he was in trouble." I had to put the phone down for a moment. Sharon's report went to DCS. DCS opened an emergency assessment. Krista was notified. Within 3 days, Margaret had filed an emergency custody petition. The preliminary hearing was in February. The judge granted temporary custody to me while the full case was evaluated. Krista filed an opposition immediately. Her attorney Fletcher argued that the disclosure was coached, that Danny had been primed by months of exposure to a grandmother who was, in his words, deeply invested in a narrative that would give her control over the child. That was the word he used. Narrative. Danny came to live with me in February. He brought a backpack and a drawing pad and not much else. He stood in my kitchen and looked around the way you look at a place you've been before but aren't sure you're allowed to be comfortable in. I said, "The guest room is yours. There's a drawing table in there. Earl built it." He said, "Okay." Then he went to look at the refrigerator. He found the drawing. He stood in front of it for a while. Then he said, "That hat is terrible." "You drew it," I said. "I know," he said. "I was 5. I made grilled cheese for dinner." He ate 2 of them. The full custody hearing was in March. That's the room I described at the beginning. Krista on the stand, saying Wade was more of a grandfather than I'd ever been. Fletcher saying my concern was harassment. the fluorescent light doing what it had been doing for 20 years. When Margaret submitted my documentation, she walked the judge through it methodically. 47 separate dated entries spanning 8 months. Behavioral indicators organized by clinical category. 2 incident reports filed with DCS. Sharon Pruitt's documentation from the school. A letter from the DCS caseworker who had conducted the second home visit, which she had asked to submit voluntarily. Margaret said, "Your Honor, Mrs. Calloway spent 28 years as a pediatric nurse. She is not describing grandmother's intuition. She is describing clinical observations she has been trained to make, documented in the format she was trained to document them." Fletcher said, "Objection. She's a retired nurse, not a forensic psychologist." The judge said, "Overruled. Continue." The hearing lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the judge spoke for about 12 minutes. She said several things I wrote down afterward because I wanted to make sure I had them correctly. Among them, the court finds the grandmother's documentation to be thorough, credible, and consistent with professional observational standards. The court further finds the child's own voluntary disclosure, documented independently by a mandated reporter, to be sufficient grounds for continuing the current custody arrangement. She said the full custody determination would be reviewed in 60 days. In the interim, Danny would remain with me. She looked at Krista. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, meaning Krista, this court encourages you to use this period to access the counseling resources available to you through the county. The court is not indifferent to your loss. But a child's safety cannot wait for the adults around him to be ready." Krista was crying, not dramatically. The way you cry when something that has been held together comes apart. I did not watch her. I was writing. "I want to stop here. Not to give you a lesson. You don't need one from me. But I do want to say something about what this kind of fight costs. Because when people hear grandmother wins custody, they think it ends there. It doesn't end there. I spent 8 months building a 2-inch folder. I spent thousands of dollars in legal fees. I spent hours on hold with DCS offices that were understaffed and doing their best in a system that is not designed for speed. I spent weeks managing the specific guilt of wondering whether I was doing the right thing or whether I was, as Fletcher suggested, a woman who had lost her son and couldn't let go. I am a retired pediatric nurse. I have seen what happens to children when the adults who see warning signs decide the cost of acting is too high. I have written their charts. I have held their parents' hands in waiting rooms. I know what the other outcome looks like. That knowledge is what got me out of bed on the mornings. I wasn't sure I was right, but I want to tell you something I don't know. I don't know if Krista is a bad mother. I know she made choices that put Danny in a situation he didn't deserve. I know she was grieving, and that grief did things to her judgment that she may not have seen happening. I know she loved Brian. I know she loves Danny. The night after the hearing, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about Krista at 29 with no husband and a little boy and a life she had to rebuild from whatever was left. I thought about Brian and what he would have wanted for both of them. I didn't have answers to those questions. What I had was a child who knocked on the door of his own house because he wasn't sure if it was safe to go in. That was the thing I wasn't able to let pass. Not for the sake of keeping peace, not for the sake of any relationship. That one thing was where I drew the line, and I would draw it again. But I want to be honest that drawing that line cost something real. Not just money and time. It cost a version of the family I had believed I still had. That version is gone now. What's in its place is something I don't have a word for yet. Full custody was granted in May. I won't go through all of it. Margaret handled the legal details. The final order gave me primary custody with supervised visitation for Krista, contingent on her completing a family counseling program and demonstrating stable housing without Wade Simmons present. Wade was not charged with anything. There was not enough for a charge. What there was enough for a judge. Krista entered a counseling program in June. She is still in it, as far as I know. She and Danny have phone calls now supervised through a family court coordinator. Danny talks to her on Sunday evenings. I give him the phone and go to the back porch. I don't listen. Danny finished 3rd grade. He finished it well better than he'd done in 2nd grade, Sharon told me. Which she didn't have to do, but did anyway. He rejoined the soccer league he'd dropped out of in January. He is not, as people in stories are sometimes described, thriving. He is a 9-year-old who has lost more than a 9-year-old should have to carry. Some days are harder than others. We have a therapist he sees on Wednesdays who he describes as fine, I guess. That is probably the most accurate thing he has said about anything. We have dinner at the kitchen table most nights. He does his homework at the same table where Earl used to keep the yellow legal pad. He draws while I cook. He has started putting faces on his people again. Last month, he finished a drawing and held it up across the kitchen table. It was two figures, one tall, one small. The small one had a very large hat. He got up and taped it to the refrigerator, next to the one he made when he was 5. He stepped back and looked at both of them. "The hat's better now," he said. "It really is," I said. He went back to his homework. I went back to the stove. The house smelled like something cooking, and outside the Tennessee heat was finally starting to break, and the front porch swing was still there on the porch where Earl built it in 1992. I haven't sat in it yet. I think I will soon. If you are watching this and you have noticed something about a child in your life, something you can't quite name yet, something that just feels wrong, I want to tell you what I learned from 28 years in pediatrics and 8 months of fighting. Write it down, date it, use plain language. Keep writing. You don't have to be a nurse to do this. You have to be someone who pays attention and refuses to stop. The system is imperfect. It asks for more proof than you think should be necessary. It moves slowly. It will send caseworkers who write assessments that feel like they missed the entire point. It will frustrate you to the edge of what you can hold. Do it anyway. Keep documenting, keep filing, keep calling, because the difference between the child who gets help and the child who doesn't is usually one adult who was still writing things down when everyone else got tired. I'm not sure I handled every part of this right. I think about Krista. I think about what she lost, and whether there was a version of this where she and Danny both came out the other side intact. I don't know if that version existed. I try to believe it did, and that I just couldn't find it. What I know is this. My grandson knocked on the door of his own house because he wasn't sure it was safe to go in. I knew that look. I had seen it for 28 years. I wasn't going to see it on him and stay quiet. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. Would you have kept filing reports after the first one failed, or would you have found another way? And if you know a grandparent who is right now sitting at a kitchen table trying to figure out if what they're seeing is real, send this to them, not as advice. Just so they know somebody else went through it and didn't stop writing. I'll see you next time. Take care of the children in your life, and keep a yellow legal pad somewhere you can find it.